When animals kill humans, authorities may take swift action to eliminate the threat. Once an animal has tasted human flesh, they almost always attack again. But sometimes the animal evades authorities trying to hunt him down and lives to kill another day. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. In today's episode, we tell the story of 3 killer animals that are still on the loose. Welcome to Final Affliction. It was May of 2007, and Indonesia hadn't had a dry season quite this severe in years. The sun was swelteringly hot, and there was almost no moisture in the air. The locals, who are more acclimated to tropical conditions, were wishing for the wet season to arrive. Even if that meant flooding and storms, at least they would finally get some respite from the heat. Of all the islands, Komodo Island was suffering the most. The island is much less urbanized than the rest of the country, allowing for more wildlife to thrive there. This is pivotal to the island's ability to protect the famed Komodo dragon that lives there. There are 2 other Indonesian islands that also have decent-sized populations of these unique lizards, but none more so than Komodo Island itself. Various bird, oceanic, and reptile species call the island home, but it's the deer and wild boars that are the Komodo dragon's main food source. The Indonesian people are very protective of their unusual and extremely dangerous lizard, not only because they are a rare animal found nowhere else in the world, but also because their tourism industry is utterly reliant on the animal's survival. There are other places that have monitor lizards, but the Komodo dragon, though related to the monitors, is unique. It's the only one in the genus that is venomous, and they are the largest of them all. Even if you manage to survive an attack from one of these beasts, the chances of dying from infection and hemorrhage after the event are almost certain. Most of the very few survivors are those who were lucky enough to have the affected limb amputated within minutes of the initial bite, but most attacks end in death. And yet, despite thousands of these vicious creatures crawling all over the island, the inhabitants of Komodo live quite peacefully among the modern-day dragons. Life just goes on. Business is taken care of, and children play without a care in the world. In all fairness to the inhabitants of the island, attacks are incredibly rare. Mostly, they are reserved for the very unfortunate souls that happen to walk right on top of one of these creatures. Any animal will attack if it's cornered, after all, whether you meant to aggravate it or not. But on this day in May, it wasn't a case of an accidental meeting between a human and a predator. This time, the creature was actively hunting. You see, the dry and hot weather was a lean season for the animals in the Philippines. There wasn't as much food growing for the herbivores, so they died or managed to make it to one of the other islands that were close enough. That meant that the only large predator on the island had less to eat than usual. The Komodo dragons were becoming restless and ravenous. Only extreme conditions would have driven the 10-foot monstrosity to heave its 300-pound body into the village to look for food. Right after most of the adults had left for work, the children were out playing. Even as early as it was already hot. In a few hours, it would be so warm that even kids, who never seemed to mind extreme weather when they could be having fun, would seek shelter in their homes. Rudaharto Safina was one of the few older people around that morning, besides the children and the very oldest that lived in the community. He liked to keep an eye on the kids, since a lot of them were his own nieces and nephews. That's just the kind of values the Philippines are built on. Everyone looks out for everyone. Rudaharto grew up being watched by his relatives, and he was happy to do the same while he serviced his fishing gear in the shade of his front stoop. One of the youngsters out that day was Little Rudaharto, or Young Rudy, as everyone called him. There were so many Rudahartos in the Safina family that people needed a way to distinguish the boy from his uncle and his grandfather, who also shared the same name. Rudy was one of about a dozen children out playing a game of soccer in the street that day. Rudaharto sat down to watch his 8-year-old nephew play, and he had to smile at how little Rudy disregarded all of the rules. The little boy thought it was incredibly funny to intentionally annoy his friends by picking up the ball and pretending that he was playing American football instead. Not that the children minded, they were laughing just as hard as Rudy was. It was too hot to take the game too seriously anyway. But just a few meters away from the children, hidden by a clutch of bushes, lay the Komodo dragon that had slunk toward the village early that morning. Dozens of people passed by it, oblivious to the danger that hid beneath the dry foliage. It was perfectly camouflaged. The morning was so busy with people heading to work and the early bustle of daily chores that it had not dared to strike just yet. It was ravenously hungry, but it wasn't stupid. There was no way that it was going to storm into a street bustling with people who would surely kill it on sight if it dared show itself. No, the reptile was going to have to wait for one unlucky human to get separated from the pack. It had been looking for food for 2 days now, but there were just no deer or boars to be found. Humans were a dangerous prey to target. The animals knew that full well, but desperate times called for desperate measures. All it needed to do was be patient. Surely one of them would come within reach sooner or later, and unfortunately for little Rudy, that moment came all too soon. After an hour of rambunctious play and plenty of water breaks, Rudy had a very full bladder, so he called out to his friends to stop the game and wait for him to get back. He wasn't going to miss out on the fun if he could help it. Rudy ran as fast as he could to the clump of bushes on the other side of the road to relieve himself. The thing that was lying in wait couldn't have asked for a target to come any closer. The skinny boy was running straight at the bushes where it was hidden. Rudy did not even glance at the ground, or he would have run the other way when he saw the dragon that was coiled there. But his eyes were on the game, making sure that his buddies didn't dare go on without him. Poor Rudy hadn't even had the opportunity to undo his pants when the beast sprang at him. As he screamed, his entire body was lifted above the bushes. The lizard hadn't just bitten into him, it took after Rudy at a run. When it closed its jaws around Rudy's thin frame, both the boy and the animal were lifted several feet into the air, propelled by the pure brute force and speed that it hit Rudy with. For a second that seemed to last an eternity, the boys in the dirt street and Rudaharto stared in horror at the scene that was unfolding before them. Rudy and the dragon sailed through the air, and as they came down from their airborne arch, the creature started shaking its head violently. The moment it tasted blood, it wasn't going to wait until it hit solid ground before it started tearing its prey to shreds. In a shower of blood and limbs, they hit the ground with such a crash that the ground beneath the kids and Rudaharto's feet trembled. That's when Rudaharto sprang into action. The man sprinted toward the bloody scene, picking up the soccer ball as he ran. It was the biggest thing he could get his hands on. He threw it with pinpoint accuracy, but the air-light ball merely glanced off the raging lizard's back without the creature even taking notice of it. It was shaking the screaming boy so ferociously that the child's limbs detached from his body as he was flailing so violently. Halfway across the road, he picked up a fist-sized rock and threw that too, and several more rocks flew at the reptile from behind him. Rudaharto's action also brought the young boys out of their stupor, and they threw their own earthen missiles at the animal too. There were dozens of rocks flying through the air, and before the boys threw the second round of rocks, the rest of the few villagers in the vicinity moved in with brooms, empty bottles, and whatever else they could get their hands on. In the shower of blood, pieces of Rudy's flesh, dust, and the thrashing body of the thing that was trying to rip the young boy to pieces, it was impossible to tell what they were hitting. The beast finally felt the strikes, and it released its catch to find the source of the pain. When it looked up, it saw some 20 people moving in on it, mercilessly pelting it with sharp things that broke its skin and left searing wounds. There was no way that it could fight off the horde, so it turned tail and scuttled with a surprising speed toward the deeper bush, taking Rudy's lower half with him. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving a trail of blood in the bone-dry earth behind it. But tiny Rudy was in worse shape. The monster had ripped him completely in two. From the waist down, there were nothing but tatters of muscle and entrails. His legs and hips had disappeared into the wilderness with his attacker. It was a miracle that he was still conscious at all. Rudy was beyond screams and words now. He stared wildly at his neighbors as they descended upon him, his breathing shallow and labored. Rudaharto kneeled beside his nephew. He'd taken off his shirt and was trying to stem the bleeding from the ruined stump that was left of Rudy's body. The men, women, and children started removing their own shirts to help stop the flow. But Rudaharto had barely placed the fourth piece of fabric around Rudy when the boy shuddered and went still. That mischievous smile would never again grace his face, and all that was left was the ghost of the final moments of terror in his blank, staring eyes. Emergency services came just a few minutes later, though they only came to remove the remains. By that time, the villagers were already in the trees, armed with shovels, picks, and sharpened sticks. They wanted to avenge Rudy and the trauma that his little friends endured, but it was of no use. Among the thousands of Komodo dragons, there was just no way to tell which one attacked Rudy. They looked for one that bore the injuries from the rocks and glass bottles that they threw at it, but to no avail. The beast was gone, and after a week of searching, they had to give up. By that time, most of its wounds would have healed, and it would become entirely impossible to tell it apart from the others. Having tasted human flesh for the first time, it is only a matter of time that it strikes again, bringing another unsuspecting villager like Rudy to their terrifying final affliction. Sultan Bathery, India is a place that's got an unusual mix of both the old and the new, ancient and modern. Cut into the wild jungle are patches of farmland, little towns bustling with people, and even temples built hundreds of years ago by ancestors that no one can name anymore. In one of these little patches lived Thadathil Prajesh on his dairy farm. He'd inherited the business from his father, as his father did before him, and he liked his hardworking yet simple life very much. He was just far enough out of reach that the busy lives of the townspeople didn't bother him, and his quiet little family too much. Here was where Thadathil woke up to the surrounding wilderness where he was born 36 years ago. He'd spent his childhood working on the farm and playing in the trees and the waterfalls within walking distance from his house, the same house that he was now raising his own children in. He woke up every morning to the sounds of the cows in the pen and the birds out in the wild. Every morning, he got into his Jeep and drove out to do the morning chores while his wife prepared breakfast. Then, at around noon, he returned for lunch before heading out to the very edge of the farm, and there he spent the next hour or two of his day cutting down grass for his cows. He loaded his Jeep until it nearly overflowed. The grass kept the cows occupied until the next morning, until he started the ritual all over again. It was the 9th of December, 2023, and Thadathil went about his morning routine like he did every day before. His wife woke him with a cup of hot chai, and by the time she'd started cooking breakfast while nursing a fussy and teething baby, he was already starting up the Jeep. After the busy morning was behind him, he returned home for lunch and enjoyed a few minutes with his children, making the baby laugh and teaching his two older boys how to make slingshots out of some rubber cut from an old tire and a few good Y-shaped branches that he cut down for them. He left the boys to their target practice and set out in his trusty Jeep again to go and collect his herd's fodder. Thadathil drove for 10 minutes before stopping right at the edge of the tree line, but something was already waiting for him. He didn't know it, but for the past 4 days, the farmer had been watched closely by a male Siberian tiger from inside the jungle. The observant cat noticed that the man had a system that he followed religiously. He'd cut grass, load the Jeep, and when he returned the next day, Thadathil started cutting grass right next to the spot he'd last cut from. That way, he systematically cleared every square inch around his farm in increments, and by the time he'd come full circle, the place he'd started at had a fresh new patch of grass growing for his cows again. Every day that he returned, the cat was waiting in front of the section where he'd be working. And sure enough, like clockwork, Thotathil arrived and cleared a few feet of growth with his scythe, right in front of the tiger watching from the trees. After clearing some growth, he sat down with his back to the trees and started making bundles that he tied with blades of grass before loading them into the back of his Jeep. The predator waited until the man placed the scythe on top of the vehicle. The animal wasn't stupid. It knew very well that this seemingly primitive tool was incredibly dangerous. If that long blade could slice through grass and bush as smoothly as it did, it would slice through a living animal too. So it waited patiently until the potential weapon was well out of the human's reach before it started to slink out of the bushes from where it was hiding. Thotathil was whistling a nursery rhyme he'd learned as a boy, lost in his thoughts and the task at hand. All the while, the animal crept up closer and closer behind him. Its paws were silent as they sidestepped the sticks and leaves that littered the ground. Its shoulders were hunched, ready to pounce. With a final twitch of its tail, the beast let out a roar that sent the birds in the nearby trees into the air. Thotathil turned sharply at the sudden sound, and to his horror, the tiger was already right above him. Its extended claws were held wide, and its jaws were already open as it fell on top of him. Thotathil was pounded onto his back, and the pair of them skidded over the ground, leaving a groove in the earth as they went. The beast was aiming for his throat, but Thotathil turned around just as it landed on him, so its teeth sank into the man's face instead. Vicious and frenzied, the animal shook its prey. Thotathil screamed as his skin was torn from his skull. One of the tiger's claws was tearing through his back, and the other was hooked into the space between his shoulder and neck. Desperately, Thotathil clawed at the massive animal on top of him, but all his hands managed to get a hold of were clumps of orange and black fur. It wasn't the bite on his head that killed Thotathil. It was the single nail that managed to embed into his neck. The femoral artery was punctured, and he bled out, but not before the skin on his face was entirely ripped off the bone. When the man finally went limp, the tiger dragged him into the midst of the trees where it could eat in peace with no fear of any more humans coming along to disturb it. Thotathil's wife knew something was wrong when night fell and her husband hadn't returned for dinner. She didn't waste time trying to search for him in the dark. With 3 young children in tow, she called the authorities and every neighbor in the vicinity. The search party found the Jeep almost immediately. The pool of blood on the ground next to a bundle of grass shimmered in their torchlights. From there, it didn't take them long to find Thotathil's remains just a few feet from the car. He'd been decapitated, and his left leg was gnawed off entirely. There were shreds of ginger and black hair embedded under his nails. For the next 3 days, while the Prajesh family prepared for his funeral, authorities tried to track the tiger. By the size of the paw prints, they were certain that they were looking for a fully grown male, but they just couldn't track where the beast went in the thick overgrowth of the jungle. But everyone in the area knows that once a tiger kills a human, it always comes back to bring more people to their terrifying final affliction. In almost every regard, alligators are the apex predator within their habitat. Being opportunistic feeders means they are not particularly picky and will eat anything from small mammals, other reptiles, pets, and in some cases even other alligators. In even rarer instances, these animals have been documented eating humans. When these attacks happen, they can be catastrophic to those who are exposed to the prehistoric power of these animals, and often they don't survive to tell the tale. This is why most people are advised to keep their distance from the edge of swamps or lakes to ensure their safety. But some people believe that they don't have to listen to the advice given to keep them protected, and they have to face the consequences of their decision alone. On July 2nd, 2015, Tommy Woodward and his friends were drinking heavily together. Tommy was 28 years old and lived very close to his twin brother, having only recently stopped living together. They had an incredibly close relationship, as you would imagine for a pair of twins. That night, Tommy was drinking at his regular bar called Adams Bayou, which was right next to Burkhart's Marina. A local construction worker was telling the group of a huge alligator that he'd seen in the marina recently. He had already told the owner, and they had placed a sign to dissuade people from swimming in the water until they were able to capture the animal. So far, the sign had worked, and they'd had no issues so far. They were only mildly concerned, as alligators were regular visitors in the area anyway. While they were used to their presence, the alligators were also used to the presence of humans, and so did not exhibit any fear towards them. They are stealthy hunters, and if given the chance, they could easily pull someone into the water to become their next meal. The worry was that someone would jump in the water, unknowingly jumping right next to the hidden reptile, and be taken. As a result, it was understood by the members of the bar to avoid the water until they could catch the large alligator. This seems like common sense, but when you have a lot of men who have been drinking for hours on end, it may not be as straightforward as they may have hoped. That night, a little after midnight and after several hours of drinking, Tommy and his friends headed down to the marina's edge. They observed the no swimming sign and decided to ignore it and investigate for themselves. As they watched the water, they suddenly saw a huge alligator raise its head from the water, seemingly observing them from a few meters away. It had a scarred head, suggesting that it had been in many fights and won in the past, carrying the battle scars with him as a reminder of his ferocity. Tommy's friend Victoria noticed the animal eyeing them and began to scream, knowing that they would not stand a chance if they were to jump in the water with such a mighty animal. She warned Tommy not to jump in the water, knowing now that it was a bad idea that they had even come this close to the water's edge. Tommy didn't share this thought. He was incredibly intoxicated by this time of the night, and instead of heeding his friend's advice, he began to shout at the alligator instead. His friends told him to stop, that he was putting himself at risk, but he continued shouting, "F that gator." The animal was becoming more antagonized as he continued to shout at it, before he took it one step further. Laughing, he ran forward and jumped into the water right in front of the alligator. His friends shouted out to him, begging him to come back to shore, but he was too drunk to listen. He began swimming further out, aiming for a small island on the other side of the bayou, and continued to ignore his friends as they told him to come back in from the water. Suddenly, and without a sound, Tommy disappeared under the water. Unsure of what was happening, the friends stared at the water while holding their breath in fear, waiting for him to resurface. He burst back into sight and began shouting to Victoria to stay out of the water. He noticed that she was already planning to come and save him, and he shouted again that the alligator had him and she couldn't get in the water to save him under any circumstance. Instead, Victoria began to run back to the bar as Tommy was dragged back under the water. She knew that she needed to get help, as the alligator would not show her friend any mercy. She ran into the bartender, Michelle Wright, and explained what was happening just a few meters from the bar. Michelle was horrified and confused as to why Tommy would decide to do such a thing. All patrons had been warned several times not to jump into the water. She quickly phoned 911 and informed them that there had been an animal attack. Although she couldn't confirm the state of the victim at the time, the air was tense. Everyone knew that this situation was unlikely to have a happy ending. Meanwhile, Tommy was fighting for his life. He knew his friend would try and get some help, but at the moment he was alone in the water with an alligator, a less than ideal situation. His lack of sobriety was also causing him great issue as he was becoming very disoriented and finding it difficult to stay above the surface. The alligator had initially grabbed onto his leg and pulled him down, trying to drown him with a death roll. Tommy had been able to kick the animal in the nose with his free foot and break free, but now he was injured and bleeding out into the water, leaving a trail for the predator to follow. He was glad that he stopped Victoria from following him and making the same mistake, but now he was living on borrowed time. He tried swimming back to the marina, using his uninjured foot to propel himself while he prayed that nothing else would grab him. The water was very cold, and as he lost more blood, he felt himself becoming more and more lethargic. As he was dragging himself through the water, he heard the water moving slightly behind him. As it was very late, it was quiet enough to hear a pin drop, so a massive alligator making its way towards someone could definitely be noticed. Tommy realized that he was still being pursued and began to panic, thrashing more and more as he tried to escape the approaching reptile. Unfortunately for him, alligators can swim at 32 kilometers per hour, so he was quickly caught. He screamed out as the animal grabbed onto his arm and pulled him downwards, rolling with him underwater to further disorient him. Even in his drunkenness, the pain was overwhelming for Tommy as he felt the gator's teeth sink further into his legs and the carbon monoxide in his lungs building up. Finally, as he felt himself unable to hold his breath any longer, he knew that he was doomed, realized he should have never mocked the alligator in the lake. Then, as his lungs used up the last bit of oxygen in his lungs, he gasped for air as the murky water rushed into his lungs. He instantly fell unconscious and surrendered to the alligator. After phoning 911, Michelle and Victoria ran back to the water's edge and tried to spot Tommy in the water once again. Sadly, by the time they arrived back at the marina, he was already floating face down on the surface. He was clearly dead. Dark red blood was pooling around his body. His friends decided that they would soon need to recover the body and give it back to his family. Before they could even come up with a plan, the alligator dragged his body under the water again, taking it further away from the marina as it settled down to eat its prey. After some time, the 911 officers arrived on the scene and the search for Tommy's body began. They scoured the marina for 2 hours until they were finally able to find his dismembered corpse across the lake. His left arm was completely missing, and his body was covered in bite and claw marks. It was determined that the animal had grabbed his elbow and dragged him into the depths to drown him, something that it was successful in achieving. Locals arranged a hunt to try and locate the man-eater, but they were unsuccessful, suspecting that it had simply swam back out of the marina and would not be seen again. Kent Roberts, a local in the area and friend of Tommy's, thought differently. He had seen the animal previously and knew that it would be back. He set up several traps and lines around the area, hoping to snare the creature and make it pay for the death of his friend. Not long after, the alligator was captured in one of his traps, and so Kent fired 7 rounds straight in the alligator's head. Although the animal was stopped, his story has been used as a fatal tale, knowing that the entire situation was avoidable if Tommy had just avoided the water as he had been told. Although it was ultimately the reptile that killed Tommy Woodward, it was drunkenness and pigheadedness that really claimed a life that night. Had Tommy been in the right state of mind, he may have avoided his terrifying final affliction.